So the readings for this week focus on putting faith into action. And this aligns with the theme of values and actions, what I've seen coming up recently in my life. And so we want to think about what is it that we value and how are we putting this into action? If we believe all things are interconnected, then what does this call us to do differently in the world? Food is a way I have found that demonstrates our interconnectedness and gives us a tangible way to put values into actions. I studied nutrition and public health and learned about and began to work on addressing diet-related diseases, health disparities, and simultaneously also came to understand eco-spirituality through the life and practice of St. Francis of Assisi and other various faith traditions through Green Faith. And I started connecting the dots between this eco-spirituality and my work in food justice and public health, and became very interested in the connections between food and faith that it seems very few people were making. I read Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating by Norman Wirzba, and then met others thinking about these connections through Wake Forest University School of Divinity, Food, Health, and Ecological Wellbeing program. Since then, I have consistently looked for more of these connections to make and see it as essential that our spirituality includes an ethic of the land that includes an understanding of the role food plays in this ethic and in our lives. By far, the best spirituality of food I've seen articulated has been by Thich Nhat Hanh. And he says, "This piece of bread is the body of the whole cosmos. If Christ is the body of God, which he is, then the bread he offers is also the body of the cosmos. Look deeply and you notice the sunshine in the bread, the blue sky in the bread, and the cloud and the great earth in the bread. Can you tell me what is not in a piece of bread? The whole cosmos has come together in order to bring you this piece of bread. You eat it in such a way that you come alive, truly alive." And in The Meal That Reconnects, Eucharistic Eating and the Global Food Crisis, the author, Mary McCann, says that at the heart of the Eucharist is the common table, which should speak of the common good. She explains more about the practicalities of how this common table enabled a way of working towards the common good. Jesus' table sharing was not almsgiving, which reinforces social and economic divisions rather than making people equal. Instead of offering charity, Jesus' meals created a common table, a shared egalitarianism of spiritual and material resources, rooted in a deep respect for the land and a realization that its abundance belongs to all. She also explained the many dimensions of life that need to be reconciled in order to bring about this common good. At the table, everything that creates the world is present: economics, politics, power, the potential for rivalry and competition, bonds among friends, boundaries against enemies. So I see a way of working towards this common table and common good, starting with mindful eating. Through the insights of Thich Nhat Hanh and Mary McCann, we can see how the Eucharist demonstrates our interconnectedness. When we expand the idea of the Eucharist beyond simply a wafer to include all food that comes from the earth, that comes from God as sacred, it adds many layers of accountability for us to consider, for us to make sure that food was produced and made its way to us as ethically as possible. We may consider, how is that food being produced? How is it being transported throughout the food system? Is the environment being damaged? Are workers being harmed? Is the food being processed in such a way that's damaging to our health and therefore our bodies as temples of God? What about the diet-related health inequities that result when low-income communities, especially communities of color, do not have the same access to healthy, affordable foods as higher-income communities, but are instead targeted with advertisements for ultra-processed foods and sugary beverage advertisements? Considering these questions in light of the Eucharist, or in light of our understanding of the interconnectedness of all things and all people, we can ask, how can we intervene to create more sustainable, ethical, healthy, and just food systems? If we think of these questions when we eat, we can not only practice mindful eating, but see food from a spiritual lens. A couple years ago, I was involved with starting a program called Mindful Eating for the Beloved Community in partnership with BCA Global. And we started off with talking about mindful eating, providing some food demonstrations, because that's what they do as a culinary organization, and then providing some education about food systems, health inequities, opportunities for making changes within the food system, and to intervene for food justice, such as different ideas along the food chain. So growing food, eating more locally and regionally, eating food that's less processed, less packaged, eating less meat and reducing waste. and food policy change. So for example, the US dietary guidelines don't align with subsidies in the Farm Bill. And there's a lot of marketing for unhealthy foods as well. So there's a lot of different places to intervene in the food system. There's also a lot of, there's industrialization, there's externalized costs, land degradation, farmers are not paid fairly, food workers are not treated well. There's a lot of environmental toxins and ultra-processed foods in the food system. There's large conglomerates, contributions to climate change, and a lot of packaging in this industrialized food system. And meanwhile, people are still experiencing food and nutrition insecurity. And there's also other impacts on public health. So there's synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, degradation of air, water, and soil from animal waste and agricultural runoff from concentrated animal feeding operations. There's also toxins that lead to respiratory problems, workplace injuries, cancers, antibiotic resistance, and then there's inexpensive, low nutrient food. So there's a lot of things broken about this current food system that is largely dominating what we have access to eat. And then on the other hand, there's ways to promote more regenerative agriculture through farmers markets and eating more locally and getting to know your farmer. And then there's different ways that we can make changes. So we can make changes on lifestyle dietary patterns on an individual level. So by reducing intake of animal-based products. There's a campaign called Beans is How from the Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub. And then there's a concept called reducitarianism, which is reducing production and consumption of animal products 50% by 2040. That's the goal of the organization that promotes this concept called 50 by 40. And then ensuring the rest is environmentally and socially sustainable. So there's different areas to intervene, whether it's on our personal dietary lifestyle habits or on larger food systems changes that we can make through policy. And there's different ways for people in faith communities to engage at local, national, and global levels. A couple of years ago, I put together a proposal. It was called the Food System Vision Prize proposal. It includes different ideas around mapping the food system and what our faith community is doing, providing trainings on these connections between food and faith, action, promoting sustainable agriculture, building support for a healthy food system, having faith in food convenings, growing food on religiously owned land, having communal meals, and more communication about all these initiatives. So raising awareness among faith communities nationally is another opportunity I've been involved in about the 2022 White House National Strategy on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. It was they did the conference last year, and there's a national strategy that came out of it. There's multi-faith group of organizations that's interested in promoting this national strategy. And then there's also the Faith and Food Coalition at the global level, which is an interfaith group of global faith-based organizations that came together for the UN Food System Summit in 2021. And while there's all these opportunities to get involved with food systems, we can't just address health disparities by looking at food systems. All public health issues or determinants of health are interconnected. So if there's a homeless person, they don't have a kitchen to cook in. So it's harder to have healthy food for people to prepare. So as I shared earlier, as Mary McCann explained in her book, The Meal That Reconnects, there are many dimensions of life that need to be reconciled in order to bring about this common good, such as economics and politics. About 5 years ago, a colleague and I started envisioning the Interfaith Public Health Network, or IPHN, as a way of facilitating impactful relationships between faith communities and organizations to advance public health. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And the IPHN guiding values include cultivating interfaith action, so finding areas of agreement, adopting a population health framework, so working to address policy systems, environmental changes, taking more of an upstream approach to finding the root cause of poor health, relying on science and context, so making sure that there's no conflicts of interest and that we're taking diverse science perspectives into account, so indigenous worldviews, for example, that might not have as much research backing it, but we know that it's time tested in terms of how useful that information is. Working for social justice and health equity, so not being partisan, and then seeking the common good and countering systemic greed. And so all of this goes to say that health is not just about individual decisions, but also powerfully shaped by our communities. And Katerina, if you can share there's a slide that I want to show you that kind of visualizes some of this. It's called the Health Impact Pyramid. Thanks. So as you can see in this visual, there's socioeconomic factors is at the bottom of the pyramid. So these are all these issues that affect people's daily lives in terms of like housing and economics and all of these different factors. And then those have the biggest population health impact by addressing it. And then as you go up in the pyramid, there's more increased individual effort needed and has less of a population health impact. So you can also change the context to make healthy decisions. You can have protection interventions, clinical interventions, and counseling and education. But the further away that you get from addressing those socioeconomic factors, the more individual effort is needed, which makes it harder, and you're not having as big of an impact on the population. All right, thanks, Katerina. You can close that one now. So there's different social determinants of health. So for example, poverty, education, housing, land use, employment, transportation, incarceration, racism, stigma, and stress. And these are defined as the causes of the causes. And these are non-medical factors that influence health outcomes, the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life. And these forces and systems include economic policies and systems, development agendas, social norms, social policies, and political systems, according to the World Health Organization. And poverty impedes cognition, for example, and decision-making, as well as reduces access to preventative care. So they're all interconnected. There's also a couple other types of determinants of health. There's commercial determinants of health, which are adverse health effects associated with for-profit actors and their actions. Includes health-harming industries like alcohol, automobiles, firearms, food, pharmaceuticals, tobacco, extractives, and chemicals. And also other pathways like occupation-related disease, wages, benefits, and employment policies. Dr. Nick Freudenberg writes about these in his book, Lethal But Legal: Corporations, Consumption, and Protecting Public Health. There's also environmental determinants of health. So climate, clean air, clean water, home exposures, work exposures, food exposures, noise and radiation. And for example, we saw the air quality and smoke crisis earlier this year. And then this air quality and smoke is an impact of climate change and drier forests that catch on fire. And then natural disasters disrupt clean water, increased temperatures make it harder to grow food in drier climates. And then we also have political determinants of health. So regulation, budgeting, tax policy, privatization, justice systems, healthcare systems, voting rights, and money in politics. So when we have tax cuts to the wealthy, or we look at the power of the corn and soy lobbies influencing food and agricultural policies, like in the Farm Bill, these are all examples of political determinants of health. So our tendency, especially in the West and as Americans, is to focus on individual level, but that leads to more of a focus on charity than justice and more rescue and treatment than prevention. And as people of faith, we can come together to do actions that can have bigger impacts on society. So Father Michael Rosier, who's a Jesuit, he writes in this article called "When Population Becomes the Patient," and he explains how Pope Francis invites us all to imagine new ways that mercy might be lived out in today's world. He takes this imagination and applies it to the Gospel of Matthew and says, "For I was hungry and you ensured I did not live in a food desert. I was thirsty and you guaranteed my tap water was safe to drink. A stranger and your laws allowed me to find asylum. Naked and your donation did not shame me. ill and you ensured I had affordable health insurance. In prison and the system rehabilitated me. And so there's different things that faith communities can do in terms of health. There's the idea of religion as a social determinant of health. So we can think about the impact that prayer has on overall health and communities, provide social support. There's ways of engaging in different dietary practices, so such as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for example, practices vegetarianism. And then there's practices of faith communities that can have negative public health impacts, such as in some African communities, for example, there has been spread of communicable disease transmission if they're not handling the dead properly, and diseases are spreading among a lot of people if that person had a communicable disease. And so there's also the idea of faith communities as health providers and health promoters. So faith community nurses, for example, that work in parishes and attend to the health needs of their parishes. And then there's also faith communities as agents of public health policy and structural change, which is working to address more of these systemic issues. And we can look at the spectrum of internal and external transformations that we can have through seeing that we can have spiritual changes, lifestyle, and then changes in the public sphere. So there's a whole range of ways of engaging and going deeper and considering in what areas that we can have more influence. And what does our own faith call us to do to work towards healthier and more equitable communities? And how can we work together with people of other faith traditions to move that work forward? That's a question that I've been working on asking with this Interfaith Public Health Network. And also there's something called the pastoral circle, which is a framework that tells us to look at a community's experience and then go through phases of social analysis and theological reflection, and then finally determine what actions to take. And so with IPHN, we're interested in addressing root causes of public health issues, such as diet-related diseases, environmental injustices, gun violence, and how do these determinants of health limit or facilitate healthy and safe environments and opportunities to make healthy choices? And what can we learn from our faith traditions that inspire us to take more collective action? So that's what I have to share with you today, and thank you for listening.